Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to make this as informal as it can be, so I'll try to say a few things and give you some of my perspectives, but I hope we can spend most of the time with an exchange of views. I'd like to know what's on your mind, so if you have questions or something like that. So why don't we start? Just to kind of explain why I'm here in Slovenia. I'm a retired American diplomat. I spent most of my professional career working in our foreign ministry, we call it the State Department, and serving in Washington, the capital, and then in embassies overseas, generally doing economic work, trade negotiations, and so on. And then, as she said, I ended up as an U.S. ambassador in Sri Lanka. And then at one point I was in charge of U.S. trade negotiations with Europe and the Middle East. So actually, what I'd like to talk to you about today is that subject of trade between the United States and the European Union, the countries of Europe. I'm not a government employee anymore. I retired about 6 years ago. I now work for a business association, a chamber of commerce, if you will, that concentrates on international business for our member companies. So although I have a lot of government experience, I'm not here as a government speaker. I was invited to come by the American Embassy here in Ljubljana as part of their desire to sort of bring Americans of different views to come talk about important issues. And the issue they asked me to talk about is this one that I actually work on in my business day these days. And it's this effort between the United States and the European Union to negotiate a trade agreement, or as it's now called, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. And I guess I'd just like to go back in history and kind of explain how we got there, because I think sometimes if you just read the newspaper, you think that this is maybe some idea the Americans have come up with and are trying to trick Europe into somehow. And the idea of a trade agreement, a sort of common set of rules between Europe and the United States, has been around really for almost 20 years. If you stop and think about it, Europe has maybe 50, 60 free trade agreements with countries. You have one with Korea, you have one with most of your neighbors, North Africa, former African countries, and so on, that kind of set out the rules for trade and investment in both directions between Europe and countries that it wants to have a special economic relationship with. And we in the United States sort of do the same thing. We started later. I think the first European free trade agreements actually go back to the 1960s, and America didn't start doing them until about 1990. But so we're sort of trying to catch up with what Europe has done in that area. But the key point was you have the two big kind of industrial powers, the two big developed market economies in the world, the European Union, the United States. Obviously, our economic relationship is quite close. We compete, we work together. You have American companies here in Europe, a lot of European companies in America. And in many ways, we are each other's most important partner. This is certainly most American investment in the world outside of the United States is in Europe. There's more American investment in Belgium than there is in China. I mean, we all are thinking a lot about China, about India, these big emerging markets because they're growing fast. But the reality is most European business is still done with America. There's something like 4 trillion euros of investment back and forth between the United States, the volume of investment. And it's about balance. There's about the same amount of European investment in the United States as there is American investment in the European Union. There are about 15 million people, again, about evenly divided, about 7 or 8 in each side of the Atlantic, about 7.5 million Europeans work here in Europe, in the EU, for American-owned companies. Whether that's General Electric or Microsoft or Apple for a variety of American companies, and about the same number of Americans are working for big and small European companies in all kinds of sectors of the economy. So we have a very deep, integrated economic relationship, but we don't have a trade agreement to kind of drive that. Now, we are both members of the World Trade Organization. We follow those rules and so on. But the idea was, if it's so important for the U.S. to have a free trade agreement with Morocco, and for the European Union to have a free trade agreement with Morocco, nice country, we each have important interests in Morocco, but isn't it more important for us to try to make sure that we have a common set of rules? That's really what it's sort of been missing. And there's a long and complicated story as to why we haven't had that. A lot of it goes back to differences between Europe and the United States about how we do agriculture. We just have different, so American and European trade negotiators like me have for many years been arguing about everything from wine to chickens to varieties of corn to rules about pharmaceutical products and so on. But I think sometimes what happened is that we would let those important differences, and they are important, get in the way of the bigger picture, which is the vast majority of our economic relationship goes very smoothly. Things go back and forth across the Atlantic. Companies invest, companies trade, companies buy. American companies buy European companies buy our companies, and so on. But again, there wasn't a set of trade rules to really dictate that. So in 2007 is sort of where I'll start my story. Germany at that point was in the presidency of the European Union, in the rotating 6-month presidency. Chancellor Merkel came to Washington for the every 6-month summit meeting with that was then President Bush. And I was in charge of Europe trade at the White House at that point. And the Germans came to us a couple months before and they said, the Chancellor really wants to come and propose and have the President agree that we should negotiate a comprehensive trade and investment agreement. We need that. And on the American side, this was kind of a, new idea, big idea. Let us think about that. What are you going to do about the agriculture problems? How are you going to do this? But we said, obviously, if it was important to Chancellor Merkel, and President Barroso, the President of the European Commission, was there and was fully supportive. But frankly, it happened quite late in the Bush administration. At that point, it was 2007. His mandate ran out in 2008. And frankly, our politics in the United States, we were already heading into an election. We had all the controversy about the Iraq War, and there was frankly, some tension between Europe and the United States. So the idea never really took root, and it was just too late. But instead of launching the negotiations, the European Union and the United States agreed to set up something called the TEC, T-E-C in English, Transatlantic Economic Council. And this was designed to be a cabinet level, ministerial level, EU commissioner level meeting 3 or 4 times a year to try and solve problems. Were there oranges from Spain that weren't being admitted into the United States because of some test for flies or disease? Yes, there were, and we were able to solve that problem. Were the Americans having difficulty selling chickens in Europe? Yes, and although there were promises it could be solved, it never was. But it was led by a man named Günther Verheugen, was the vice president of the European Commission, a German, very close to Merkel, and a man named Dan Price, who was in charge of international economics at the White House. And so the TEC started, we worked on a few problems, then comes 2008, and 2 big things happened. First was the financial crisis hit, and obviously it hit Europe hard, it hit United States hard. So that all of a sudden we're reeling. And then we had an election, which we do every 4 years. And President Bush was not a candidate. He could not run again. And President Obama from the other party, or more liberal party, the Democratic Party, won the election. So we have a big transition early 2009. And I'd say both Europe and the United States stopped thinking about trade agreements and just tried to keep their economies alive. Tried to get the banking systems reformed and so on. So we were all kind of busy with other business, I guess I would say, for 2009, part of 2010. We start to come back up a little bit, and then it became really obvious to both European governments and the American government that we really need to try to get more jobs created, more economic growth going in both sides of the Atlantic. So in 2011, at one of these every 6-month US-EU summit meetings, it was agreed that we should set up a high-level commission to make a study about what could Europe and the US do to promote more jobs and growth. So this was called the High-Level Study on Jobs and Growth. And started in 2011, reported back to the summit meeting in early 2013, and the main recommendation was that indeed Chancellor Merkel had been right. We should try to negotiate a high-standard agreement on trade and investment between the European Union and the United States. So the summit meeting, the President and the EU leaders announced we are going to launch negotiations. The first negotiating session, I believe, was held in July of 2013. So what's that, about a year and a half ago. And over the last 18 months, we've had 7 negotiating sessions. And these are, in the trade business, this is called a round. We're going to have a first round of negotiations, a second round. And a round, typically, and it's been the case on these US-EU negotiations, lasts about 1 week. Sometimes it's 5 days, sometimes 6 days. And what they do, the negotiations will alternate. They'll have one round of negotiations in Brussels, the next one would be in Washington, the next, they go back and forth. And typically at one of these negotiating rounds, you would have about 100, maybe 120 experts from each side. From the European side, they come only from the European Commission. The member states are not invited to send observers. This very much irritates particularly the big European states, Germany, France, Britain, that sort of are a little nervous about this commission going off and negotiating for them. But that's the rule. As you know, if you study European things, trade is a community competence, commission competence. So the European side would bring, if we were, say, having the round in Washington, about 100, 120 experts, and they'd be divided into teams focused on the major issues that are being negotiated. And typically in a negotiation like this, you would have about 15 or 20 what are called chapters, and each chapter would be a big subject area. And in the final agreement, one of these chapters might be 20 pages, it might be 40 pages, it might in some cases get very long and complicated. But examples of a kind of chapter we would be negotiating, and this is what you would find also in an EU trade agreement with Japan or with Russia or with Egypt or anyone else. But you'd have something on industrial goods, you'd have something on agricultural goods, you'd have something on services, including banking, insurance, consulting, so on like that. You'd have something, a chapter on what's called intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademark, trade secrets, very important for both the European and the American economy. You'd have a chapter about investment, what are the rules that pertain in investment, and so on. And what would happen during this week, you'd have each of these sets of teams would be meeting in a separate room. So the investment experts would be meeting in one room, and next door you might have intellectual property, and in the early rounds of the first 2, 3, 4 times partners meet, it tends to be more exploratory. Each side kind of explaining, how do you organize your agriculture trade rules? What's the system? What kind of products do you cover? All of that. But then after 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of exploration, asking questions, exchanging documents, here's something that explains our system. Here's a copy of the last trade agreement we did with another country. You can see how we do this. Then typically you would progress to the more challenging part, which is starting to write what would this chapter look like in a US-EU agreement. And so we've had 7 rounds. Let me say, well, these 10, 15, 20 different experts groups are negotiating. You also have the more senior people, the chief negotiator for each side, kind of circling around, kind of watching and saying, well, we don't seem to be making any progress in agriculture. Let's call those experts into a meeting and maybe we can give them a little nudge or we can push them or something like that. And then you send them back and give them a task or something like that. That's kind of the art of leading these negotiations. Typically, each side in each of these rounds would be led by what is called a chief negotiator. The man who is the American chief negotiator for the US-EU negotiations going on now. That's the last job that I had in the government. That was, if we had done this negotiation 7 or 8 years ago, I would have been the US chief negotiator. Typically, the ministers, the EU Trade Commissioner, used to be Karl de Gucht from Belgium, is now Cecilia Malmström, a very dynamic Swedish woman, and the U.S. Trade Minister. They would not be in these meetings. This is early preliminary exchanges. You want your experts, your negotiators doing this. At some point, maybe it's a year, 2 years down the road, these experts have presumably resolved the simpler issues. The ones they haven't get pushed up, and you try to get the chief negotiators to help find it. If they can't, you then push the more difficult issues up, and that's where the ministers, the trade commissioner, the U.S. trade ambassador have to get involved and try to help find those issues. But you can't, at any level that you are in this negotiations, you've got to solve some of the problems. You just can't send all the problems to your boss. That doesn't work very well. So you have this negotiating process going on. We've had 7 rounds of 1 week each, and some people will say, well, why are you only meeting 1 week and then you take 2 months off and then you come back? And I think what you have to understand in a trade negotiation is that, I'm making up a number, 70%, maybe 80% of the real work is not in that 1 week when I, as an American expert, am sitting across from my European counterpart. It's in that 7 or 8 weeks in between when I have to go back to my own capital and negotiate with the rest of my government to say, the Europeans have proposed this. Could we do that? How do we react? And you have to, in the case of the European Commission, their experts have to come back and talk to their bosses. They have to talk to other directorate generals, other DGs in the Commission. They talk to the member state representatives. They talk to business. They talk to civil society. So much of the negotiation is with your own government, with your own side, because that's where you have to find what's most important for us, where could we compromise a little, where cannot we compromise, and so on. So now we've had 7 rounds. I would tell you that in most of these chapters, we're still, unfortunately, still in the early stages. There's been a lot of exploration of how could we do this, why do you do it this way, here's our idea. And there are a few chapters where people have begun to sit down and try to negotiate a text that could be adopted by both sides. The last round, I think, was held in October, early October. And the reason there's been a little bit longer break, that we haven't had a session in December, November, December, 3 things. 1, the holidays. People, have holidays. The second is the EU changed commission. The Barroso Commission ran out, I think, at the end of October, and the new Juncker Commission has come in, so you have new people at the very top, and I think they wanted some time to start to get familiar with all of the dossiers that they're working on, and I think that's taken a little while. And then there's a particular issue that I'll talk about later that has gotten a lot of attention and is somewhat difficult, and the European Union needed to reconvene and figure out, and that relates to investment and how do you treat foreign investments and so on like that. So that's kind of the background of what's been going on. I will tell you that as I said, I no longer work in the government. I work for a private group of business companies, a trade association, a chamber of commerce, if you will. And we have been very active. The American businesses in general, big businesses, small businesses, are heavily involved in this idea of doing a TTIP. We strongly support it. We are working actively in Washington to explain to the members of the parliament why it's important. We're talking actively with the American negotiators, but also with the European negotiators about what we think is important. And civil society and labor and other groups are doing the same kind of thing. For us in the business world, the three things we want, I guess the four things we think have to be in this agreement. Four characteristics, I guess I would say, of the agreement. First, it has to be comprehensive. And when I say comprehensive, it has to cover all of the topics in the economic relationship. And yes, that means even the very difficult topics like agriculture and so on. But our thing, you have to cover everything. You have to have it has to be comprehensive. It has to be ambitious. We have to really try to make a difference. We have to find ways that would really reduce barriers and create possibilities for more trade, more investment, more cooperation across the Atlantic. And it has to be about high standards. We have to set a high standard, whether it's in how open it makes the market or what the regulations that relate to these products or services are. And then finally, the fourth, it needs to be balanced. It isn't like America can demand all these changes in Europe and not change anything in our way. It has to be a balance between the two sides and a balance across the different sectors that were being discussed. So I will tell you, when shortly after the negotiations were launched, the Minister for Culture in France immediately stood up in the French Parliament and said that what's called audiovisual, so rules relating to trade in movies and music and television programs, could not be discussed with the Americans because that is part of France's heritage and it had to be off the table, impossible. And our position in the American business community is no. You need to talk about it. It's going to be hard, but you... So. And then there were some people in the American government that said, our rules in America about banks, that's really not for negotiation. We can't talk about that. And we, although this was our government, we in the business community said, no, that's not right. The Europeans think this is an important chapter. We think they're right. You need to include it. There were people in Europe who said, we can't talk about agriculture. European agriculture is perfect. We can't change anything, and all these American food products are poison, No, I'm slightly exaggerating. But we don't want to do anything in agriculture. And we said, no, you have to have agriculture. And then there were people in America who said, we can't even talk about government contracts, government procurement, as it's called, and there are a complicated set of rules there. And again, we in the business community said, no, you have to talk about it. This is a real issue. We need to open up government procurement to our foreign partners. So we probably made ourselves unpopular with both the European and the American negotiators, but I think the opposite. If you start taking things off the table, if you take the agriculture chapter off, and then the Americans say, okay, if we're not doing agriculture, then we won't do services. And all you do is you ratchet down the level of ambition, and you end up with a trade agreement of no value. So that's been a very important position of principle for us in the business community, and we continue to say that. Now, I will acknowledge there are no easy issues. All the easy questions between America and Europe about trade were settled 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's why so much trade goes back and forth every day, why so many American companies are very happy investing in Europe, and Europe companies are happy investing in the United States. It works. All we have left are the problems. But the problems do matter. And if we want to provide an impetus to further growth and more jobs and more exchanges, we're going to have to tackle these challenging questions. And that's why we keep pushing. We keep pushing our government. It's why you have the American Embassy around Europe trying to bring Americans like me with different opinions about this to help provoke a good debate about this. Because both in the United States, in my view, both in the United States and in Europe, there is not a lot of understanding about what this negotiation is about, and where are the problems, and why are we doing it. So, now I thought I would sort of finish up by talking about 4 or 5 of the important issues that are in this negotiation, and maybe why they're difficult. I can't tell you what the solution is, but I want you to get a sense of them. The core kind of first chapter in every trade agreement is what is called market access. That means, is your market open to the goods and the services from the foreign partner? And if you look at the transatlantic market, set agriculture aside, we'll talk about that later, but in the industrial goods, generally we're quite open to each other. And particularly as it relates to what are called tariffs, the taxes that are put on foreign goods, generally very low. They average about 2% in the United States, about 3% in Europe. So that's really not the problem. But if you go and talk to BMW, that's making automobiles, about their problem. They're making automobiles in the United States, they're making automobiles in Germany that they sell in America, they're making automobiles in America that they sell in Germany, believe it or not. What is their problem? What complicates their ability to do more business? And the answer is not that the trade is too hard or the tariff. It's that they have different regulations. The seat belt that keeps us all safe in a car, you know, a European seat belt has totally different standards. It's tested on a different kind of a system than an American seat belt. I think I may get this wrong, but in Europe, the back lights in an automobile, the safety lights, have to be yellow. In America, they have to be red. Is a yellow light safer than a red light? Or a red light safer than a yellow light? I don't think so. I believe an American car and a German car or a French car are about the same in terms of how safe they are. But because those regulations and those technical standards are just different, it adds so much cost and inefficiency that BMW has to run 2 separate lines of producing cars. And that just adds cost, makes it more expensive for consumers, and makes it just adds to the cost and the inefficiency in the system. And in many, many products, that's what the core issue is. And these are very hard, because these are not just trade regulations. There are, in many cases, regulations that are there to promote health and safety in the environment. And I will tell you, I honestly believe that in all these areas, American regulations and European regulations offer about the same level of protection. There may be people in Europe who think of European regulations here in America. That's not the case. They're different, but the level of protection is effectively the same. But that's what much of this negotiation will be about. Are there ways that you can maintain the high level of safety, of protection, of standards, but move them to be more similar, so that it's easier to take a European product to America or an American product here? And that will be very challenging. What is happening is that in, like, I can think of 5 or 6 important sectors: automobiles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, machine tools. The industry European industry and American industry are talking among themselves and say, and let's be clear, in many of those sectors, the big European companies are also big American companies because they have branches in Europe and the big American. So it's really companies that have a lot of experience on both sides. But they are saying to the governments, here's what's a problem. This is why we have a problem. You ought to look at seeing if you can harmonize this or that. And it's very sector specific, and it will be very challenging. But that's the core of what is in the so-called market access. And if we can find ways, if the experts can find ways that can harmonize or make those regulations and standards more similar, it will lower the cost for the companies. Should mean they can hire more workers, they can sell more products, and everyone will benefit. But it has to keep the same standard. This is not about trying to lower the standard. Agriculture is even harder. If you thought that was hard, you should try agriculture. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on agriculture. If you want, we can talk into questions and answers. But Europe and the United States just have different systems as to how we do agriculture. Ours is bigger scale, more mechanized, more scientific, I would say, more new varieties of seeds. European agriculture is in general, and I realize I'm oversimplifying, smaller scale, more traditional in terms of the way it's done, and makes it very hard to find rules about how you compete. There's something ironic, just as an American, to the fact that Europe runs a big agricultural trade surplus with the United States. You sell us a lot more agricultural products than we sell you. Now, most of the European products are finished products, wines and cheeses and sausages and processed things. We're more efficient in the bulk commodities, in meats and grains and chickens, and many of those products, unfairly, I believe, run into a series of barriers. We don't allow chickens that are rinsed with a chemical. We don't allow biotech agriculture. And we could have a debate. We're not going to change that in the negotiations, but it's an example of how challenging agriculture will be. Just to jump to the end on agriculture, you might say, and I might be tempted to say, why bother? It's agriculture. It's too hard. In the United States, I think 1% of our workforce works in agriculture, and it's about 4% of our GDP. In Europe, it's a little bit more on the labor side because you're smaller scale, less efficient, I would say. But it's still a small number. The problem is, in the United States, and I believe also in Europe, when you at the end you have an agreement and you have to get it approved by the American Parliament, the Senate, the member state governments, the European Parliament, in every political system I know, farmers have a lot of political power. And people who are not farmers still identify with the traditional agriculture of their country, the way you make cheese or don't make cheese. So politically, you have to have something, but you have to approach it quite specially. So there's that whole set of issues. Another chapter where I think it's not easy. As I said, there are no easy chapters. But one chapter where the interest of the United States and Europe together is clear is in what I call intellectual property. And I think you can step back. That means patents and copyrights and trademarks. How to give some protection to the individual or the company that invests millions and millions of dollars in developing a new movie, a new medicine, a new way of doing something, a new improved engine, these new technologies. How do you give them some protection, some monopoly, so they can recoup some of the money, all of the money that they invested in this development of this product? Because if you look at the world situation now, the reality is that neither you in Europe nor we in America are going to be able to support the lifestyle we like and your children will like if we're trying to just produce basic commodities. If we're just trying to grow corn, make a block of steel, a big piece of wood, all of that. China, I have news, China and India and Brazil can do that more cheaply than we can. Partly because they have a lower wage rate, their people live at a lower standard of living, and we don't want to go down and compete with them. So we have to move upscale and do the more value-added products. That's what Europe does in agriculture, doing, you know, refined wines and cheeses and so on. And similarly, we need to do computer software, we need to do movies, we need to do the most modern design of automobile or equipment, and then which means you have to have strong intellectual property protection so that right after you spend $1 billion developing a new medicine, you don't find the Chinese stealing it and selling it a day later just because they copied it. I mean, that's a shared interest. Europe has quite good intellectual property protection, so does the United States, but as in these other areas, they're a little different. And so for a European pharmaceutical company like Sanofi Aventis, for an American pharmaceutical company like Pfizer or Merck, they invest $1 billion in developing a new improved medicine. They have to get it approved and tested, and the testing and approval systems between Europe and the United States are totally different. So again, adds to cost, adds to inefficiency, adds to delays, and so on. So that's going to be an important area. Yeah?
In the context of this whole change in regulations to harmonize it more, what do you think is a better direction, to generalize the regulation so much that it will somehow look harmonized in the end, or to go in such detail that we can actually...
You know, it's a great question, and the first thing I would say, and I think I hinted at this earlier, it is really hard to change these regulations. They've been adopted in a procedure in Europe and so on, and reviewed and approved by the member states, similarly in the United States. So it's really hard. And very frankly, politically, it is close to impossible to tell the European Union that they need to throw away their regulation and adopt the Americans. Or to tell the American regulation that instead of our regulation of chemicals, we need to adopt the so-called REACH directive on chemicals. So I think, in my view, we have to keep pushing for as much accommodation as you can, moving towards similar things, but be realistic about what you can accomplish. I don't think there's a global, it's not going to be possible to just say, if a product's approved in America, you should be able to sell it in Europe, or if it's approved in Europe, you should be able to sell it. That, especially as you get into some of these agricultural products that have different things. I mean, so I think it's going to be challenging, it's going to be kind of step by step in more detail, and it's one of the reasons it will take a while. But I think it's where this work on individual sectors, on the automotive industry, on the chemical industry, maybe the pharmaceutical industry, maybe the machinery industry, can make progress. The reality is, we do pretty well on the new regulations. A thing like nanotechnology, it's a new emerging issue, and over the last 5 years, European regulators have been trying to figure out how do you regulate nanotechnology. And there's a lot of exchange back and forth. We don't have nanotechnology regulations yet in either place, but they're going to end up very similar because the regulators have been talking. The problem is in the past when Europe wrote regulations about whatever, automobiles or biotechnology, without thinking about the international aspect, and the Americans did the same. So over time, I think it will get better as old technologies die away, but it's going to be very hard, very hard. Two other issues I talk about, and then I'd like to sort of open it up to questions and your comments. Another issue is investment, and in fact this has probably become the most controversial issue among some civil society groups and non-government organizations in Europe and to some extent in the United States. And that is, it's been long-standing practice. It started in Europe in the 1950s when the Germans did the first investment treaty, did it with Pakistan, that when a foreign investor in countries that have an investment partnership goes abroad and puts all of his or her capital, their intellectual property, all of that at risk by moving to another country a new political system, and they're at the mercy, frankly, of that government. What happens if the government of Pakistan, the government of Ecuador, or whatever, decides we don't like this German company anymore, we're going to take it over? Happened to Repsol, the big Spanish oil company, got taken over in Argentina without compensation. There's been this tradition that investors had the right to go to instead of being stuck go to an Argentinian court, good luck there. You could file for an a panel of international investment experts, and they would try to arbitrate and see is this case justified, and should they get compensation. This has been around for many years. It's in every one of the EU's trade agreements. Germany has 150 investment agreements. They all include investor state. But now civil society groups have decided to protest this, and at least in dealing with the Americans, you don't need this kind of investment protection, and this is unfair special preferences for companies, and therefore you shouldn't have coverage for investors. If they want to come and invest in Europe, they come and they take their chance. And similarly, now for us in the American business community, that's unacceptable. We have told our government and the European government we need strong investment protections, and that it needs to include some kind of provision for arbitration when there's a dispute. We don't want to have to go to the government court controlled by the government. That has become a very challenging political issue. I'd be happy to debate the issue on the substantive side, but it's out there. And then the final issue, I guess I have two issues, I'd say. One is the suggestion sometimes that this negotiation is unfair. It's only for big companies. Now, I'll tell you, most of the companies that are in my organization are big companies. I'm guilty. But the reality is, for Siemens or BMW or General Electric or Microsoft today, if they have a problem in Europe, or a European company has a problem in America, they can probably find a solution. They can hire a high-priced lawyer in Brussels or Washington. They can create a new subsidiary. They know how to maneuver through these markets, and they have more. It's a small company in Graz in Austria, or here in Slovenia, or in Texas, that's trying to see if they can export, and they try and they hit a wall. They don't have that. So I think making this trade more open, more transparent, is going to benefit everybody. Plus, it's also important to bear in mind the way business works now. When Airbus exports an airplane to the United States, or Boeing sends an airplane to Germany, that's one big company. But actually, I know Boeing case better, on an average Boeing airplane, there are 5,000 small and medium-sized companies that made this piece of wire, that made the belts on the seats, that put the lights in. So there's a lot of small business that gets embedded into large business. So this allegation that I find, this allegation that this negotiation is somehow only for the big companies, really misses the point. Today, business is done differently. It isn't like each factory is self-sufficient, they bring in the raw materials, and they produce a finished good. I understand that many of the best small, medium, large companies in Slovenia are making very specific parts, wiring or bolts or something that get sold to Germany, and they go into German automobiles or shipped to America. It's about what are called global supply chains and bringing the pieces together. So I think this distinction between large companies and small companies is really a false distinction. If you want to create more opportunity for all business, you have to open up and reduce barriers. And then the final point I would make is reacting to the criticism that's sometimes heard, and frankly I will tell you I think there is some justice in this, that this is somehow, this negotiation, and maybe any negotiation, is somehow too secret. It's not transparent enough. The public doesn't know what's going on. And so they don't understand it, and therefore all of this. And I think that's probably right, if I can, at the gross level. In the United States, this negotiation is not really understood by the public. And why are we doing it, and what's it for, and so on like that. And I think both in America and in Europe, we need to, the governments, the Commission, the United States government needs to have more discussion, more exchange, more listening to the questions that people, companies, business, labor, civil society have about this negotiation. Having said that, I think we also have to be practical. If I work for you and you're my boss, and I have to sit down and negotiate, what are you going to pay me? What's my salary going to be? I don't want to do that negotiation on the internet and say, well, I mean, at some point it is in fact a negotiation. When the Europeans and the Russians are negotiating about something, you don't do that in a football stadium and have everybody watching, and every private exchange is posted on the scoreboard. I mean, so at the end of the day, we need to have a process that is more open, more transparent, but at the end of the day also lets the negotiators have a system where they can have the right amount of privacy to explore. Because a negotiation like this, you're going to have to explore. You're going to have to say, well, I might be able to do this, but only if you did that. And if that's reported in the newspaper or on the internet, people will come out and they'll start opposing. I mean, the way you get to a solution in any negotiation involves a lot of private exploration. Maybe this could happen and something like that. So I think the challenge that exists is to make it, the negotiation, the process around it, more open, get more people knowledgeable on it, but not open it up so much that it becomes impossible to make progress in it. Because ultimately the idea is to get a good agreement that is balanced, that's fair, that's ambitious, and that covers all of the issues. So that's what's going on in this negotiation. We've been at it a year and a half. We will start back up in early February, I think the week of February 2nd to the 6th in Brussels. The 8th round of negotiations will be held. And we'll see where we go from there. I think it's very important. This is an important year. We've had a lot of time to go through the explanation, why do you do this? Now we have to get to the real negotiating stage and really start to talk about possible trade-offs, what issue is possible, what may not be possible. So that's where we are. I think it'll be very important to watch in 2015 how the negotiations advance. If we don't make any progress by the end of 2015, it's going to be hard. We start getting into different calendars, and President Obama's term will end, and so on. It gets very complicated. But anyway, that's my explanation of what is going on, why it's going on, why it's important for us in the United States, and I think important for Europe, why it's not about one side getting everything it wants and giving up nothing. But finally, just to close, my final thought is, I think we need to step back and put this effort in a broader context. And it's important to remember, the European Union and the United States are the two big industrial powers, if you will, in the world. Together we're about 50% of the global economy. 20 years ago, we were 70% of the global economy, and 20 years from now, we might be 40%, we might be 35%. It depends on how fast China grows and India grows. My point is, whatever our differences are, and there are differences between Europe and the United States, we have an awful lot in common. We are democracies, we are private sector oriented business, we recognize the right of private property, we recognize protecting intellectual property, we recognize the right of workers, the dignity of work, we try to protect the environment and not try to get an economic advantage by dumping our chemicals out the back door. We have a general set of common values. And if we can work together and reach an agreement between these two big powerful areas that set high standards in this area, that can become a model that other parts of the world economy will, if they want to trade with us, if they want to come into our system, if other countries want to do a trade agreement, China wants to do a trade agreement with Europe or the United States, it'll have to come up to the same high standard, and we can help raise up the general level of rule of law, of private enterprise, of so on like this around the world. If we don't, because some of these countries have different values. They value democracy or workers' rights or protecting the environment a little bit less. And if the US and Europe continue to differ on how we should do something, it makes it an awful lot easier for some of these other countries, maybe China, maybe India, to write their own rules, or they try and go to the United Nations and propose a different kind of a system. And if we don't do it now, if we come back 20 years ago and we, or you'll be the senior leaders in 20 years, you'll have to do it. And I'm afraid it's going to be harder. We will have gotten more into our own ways. China and India will be bigger competitors and so on. So this is the time to do it, is my pitch. So we all have to, all our governments have to work hard. We have to be prepared to make compromises. We have to be realistic about what can be done. And if we do that, I think we can do something that will advantage both Europe and the United States.